Well, welcome everyone. So today we're going to wrap up our tour of ecology. Started with the populations, moved up to the communities, and now we're at our final level of ecology, which is ecosystem ecology, which encompasses everything below it. So let's dive in. Now, an ecosystem includes all the organisms, all the communities, all the populations living in a particular place, plus all the abiotic, um, i.e., the non-living parts of the environment which they live in. So an ecosystem, again, is the highest level of organization. And as we'll see, there are many different types of ecosystems on this planet, depending on the environmental conditions in them. Now, one of the things that makes ecosystems particularly interesting is our biogeochemical cycles. So let's break down that word: chemical as in a chemical, bio as in life, and geo as in earth. So it's the chemicals of earth that biology cares about. And that's really all it is. So biogeochemical cycles is the movement of biologically relevant materials through ecosystems. And they encompass both biotic and abiotic. And just as a refresher, biotic means living, abiotic means non-living. And biochemical cycles typically cross boundaries of ecosystems. So ecosystems, while they exist on their own, are definitely connected through their biogeochemical cycles. So let's talk about some of these cycles. The first is carbon. As you guys probably know, carbon is the major constituent of your body. It's one of the most important things. Your proteins are made out of it. Your DNA is made out of it. Now, carbon and how it moves through the biosphere starts with photosynthesis or carbon fixation, which is all the metabolic reactions that make non-gaseous compounds, i.e. CO2, into sugars. Now, aerobic cellular respiration, as you probably remember from Bio 1, releases carbon in the form of CO2 back into the atmosphere. There's also another group of organisms, which are archaea, called methanogens, which actually produce methane by anaerobic cellular respiration as well. So let's look at the carbon cycle. It's pretty straightforward, where we have carbon in the atmosphere, i.e. CO2, and we have carbon in living materials, as well as dead materials as well. But you'll notice that the carbon cycle encompasses the air, the water, the land, living and dead, exchanging between them. So again, the simple way is we have organisms photosynthesizing, capturing the carbon from the air, making it to sugar, which is then eaten by other things and other things and other things and so on. So ecosystem ecology, again, tackles this idea of the carbon cycle. Now, over time, our carbon cycle has changed. Certainly it has. So for instance, our current climate crisis is definitely accelerating our carbon cycle across the planet. But the carbon cycle does proceed faster in one direction commonly. So for instance, the vast reservoirs of coal and other fossil fuels were built up over a large amount of geological time. However, our combustion of those fossil fuels has created large imbalances of the carbon cycle, leading to an increasing concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere, which we'll talk about for our final lecture. Now, the availability of water is an important thing. As you guys know, where there is water, there is life. Where there's no water, there is no life. Now, to put this in perspective, about 60% of your body is water. So water is clearly important. And the amount of water available does determine the nature and the abundance of organisms present in a given ecosystem. Now, water can be synthesized and broken down. So it is synthesized during cellular respiration, and it is broken down during photosynthesis. But again, that's a minor component of water availability relative to the amount of water on this planet. Now, how does the water cycle work? Well, liquid water from the Earth's surface does evaporate into the atmosphere. This occurs directly from the surfaces of oceans, lakes, rivers, as well as terrestrial ecosystems. Now, the reality is, as we mentioned in the plants lecture, about 90% of evaporation in terrestrial ecosystems is actually through evapotranspiration on our plants. And as this water evaporates, it goes into the atmosphere as a gaseous water. Then it eventually cools off and falls to the surface as precipitation. As we can see here in this diagram, water evaporates, condenses, comes down as precipitation, goes into the rivers, goes into the oceans, lakes, so on and so forth, and the soil as well. So. And then the final thing I'll make mention, there's this component of groundwater, which is underground reservoirs of water. Again, all of this is eventually connected in some way, shape, or form. Now, groundwater, as I mentioned, is underground water. There are aquifers, which are permeable, underground layers of rock, sand, and gravel saturated with large amounts of water. Now, about 95% of the fresh water used in the United States is from groundwater, and it is divided into two distinct parts: the upper layers, which we call the water table, and the lower layers, which we can only really be tapped by wells. So when I was growing up, I had well water. It was gross, but again, this is the lower amount of groundwater. Now, what changes water supply? Well, a couple things. As you change an ecosystem, you change the water. Now, one of the biggest things that happens to change the water cycle is actually deforestation. trees are great at holding on to water. So as you deforest an area, the water that falls as rain easily drains away, leading to tropical rainforests eventually becoming semi-arid desert. So it's pretty straightforward. But again, you can see it here. Tropical rainforest cut down to grow stuff, in particular cattle. And again, you can see it's completely changed the ecosystem from a lush forest into this essentially semi-arid region. Now, the next important cycle that we'll talk about is the nitrogen cycle. As you guys know, it's one of the most important components of proteins, amino acids, DNA, RNA, things like that. And typically speaking, our friend nitrogen here is actually in the shortest supply. And I say it's in the shortest supply because despite accounting for about 78% of our atmosphere, most nitrogen on this planet is not available to organisms to use. So organisms can't use atmospheric nitrogen or N2 gas, but instead they need ammonia, NH3, or nitrate, NO3. But again, these are in relatively low supply relative to the vast amounts of nitrogen in the atmosphere. So this leads us to a biological process called nitrogen fixation, where we have the fixation of nitrogen-containing compounds from N2 gas. This is done solely by bacteria. They take an atmospheric nitrogen, they fix it to ammonia, and then there's a group of bacteria in archaea called nitrifying organisms. They perform a process called nitrification, where they convert ammonia into nitrate. Now there's another group of bacteria out there, as well as fungi, that do a process called denitrification, where they convert nitrate back into atmospheric gas. So all this is microbial in process, and one of the sort of interesting things about this is that nitrogenous wastes, such as fertilizer, can actually radically alter the global nitrogen cycle, and humans have actually doubled the amount of nitrogen that is entering into our natural bodies of water, as well as in our soils. But let's look at this. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is fixed by bacteria. Those bacteria excrete that nitrogen into the environment or consumed by stuff, and then nitrogen and then is piled up into the ecosystems. But remember, we have this process of denitrification, which can remove nitrogen from a system, bringing it back into the atmosphere as a gaseous form. Now, the other primary component that we really care about is phosphorus. Now, phosphorus is required. It's found in all DNA, found in membranes. It's a really important part of cellular energy, i.e. ATP. Now, the interesting thing about phosphorus, it has no real meaningful gaseous form. Now, there's what we call phosphine gas. It does exist in the atmosphere, but it only lasts in the atmosphere for a very short time. So most phosphorus we see is in a solid form. In particular, it exists as PO3- or phosphate. Now, plants and algae will actually use free inorganic phosphorus, whereas so directly taking up phosphate from the environment, whereas animals have to eat plants to obtain their phosphorus. So just as a note. But let's look at this. We have phosphate in the soil and the environment. Now, phosphate is also stored in rocks and minerals. As those rocks weather away, it comes into the environment, can thus be taken up by plants and microbes, which then get put into food chains and spread the phosphorus love around. Now, ecosystems have what we call a limiting nutrient, now which we typically call like the weak link, i.e. what is in the shortest supply relative to the need of the organisms. Now, the vast majority of ecosystems on the planet are limited either by nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, when I say limiting nutrient, I mean what's limiting primary production, not just like what limits me or a cat, it's what limits primary production. So nitrogen and phosphorus are by far the two most common, but we do know iron is one of the primary limiting nutrients of algal populations in about a third of the world's ocean. So, and then there's also some other ones, like there's molybdenum as a limiting nutrient as well. But again, most places it's nitrogen and phosphorus. Iron is pretty common in the ocean as well. For deserts, it's strictly water. So it depends. Now, iron as a limiting nutrient is interesting. Now, when wind carries iron-rich dust from the Sahara Desert and in the form of sandstorms, it deposits in the ocean. It can actually stimulate algal populations to proliferate because it provides them the iron that they need, i.e. the iron that is limiting their primary production. So let's take a peek at this. We have these massive dust storms that come off the Sahara Desert, brings iron-rich sand into our oceans here and here, seeding the ocean with that iron, giving the iron to the plankton that need it, thus limiting iron as a limiting nutrient in these areas of the world. It's kind of a cool thing. So let's talk about a really cool example. So we obviously, most of us live in Massachusetts, if not all of us. we can actually look at a really fun experiment. It's actually taking place in Hubbard Brook. Now, Hubbard Brook is in New Hampshire. Now, this is a place where they've been studying forests for decades now. It's what we call a long-term ecological research site, or an LTER. Now, they've been studying biogeochemical cycling in this forest. Now, they have these undisturbed forests that are actually really efficient at attaining nutrients. And they also have these disturbed forests, i.e. cut down trees. And the amount of water runoff has actually decreased by 40%. We've seen a net loss of calcium, phosphorus, as well as nitrogen in huge amounts. And why is that? Well, again, you can see here, these areas where they have no forest next to forest, no forest next to forest. You can see this experimental plot right here. It's really cool. But again, you can see the concentration of nitrogen in deforested watersheds, i.e. what the soil cannot trap, versus concentration of nitrogen in undisturbed watersheds, i.e. what the forest can trap. And you can see that the reality is losing forest, i.e. changing this ecosystem, is bad for nitrogen cycling as a whole. Now, this leads us to a property of physics, in particular, a property called the first law of thermodynamics. Now, energy is never recycled. Energy cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed. That's just the first law of thermodynamics. Now, energy in a ecosystem exists as one of four things: light, so from the sun; chemical bound energy, i.e. food; motion, as well as heat. Now, the first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy is neither created nor destroyed, it simply changes form. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, we're talking about this because energy enters our ecosystems via light, is changed into a form to chemical energy, which then can be changed into motion or heat. So again, that's how our ecosystems are connected. Now, the second law of thermodynamics states that whenever an organisms use chemical bond or light energy, some is converted into heat, or what we call entropy. Now, the Earth itself functions as an open system for energy, whereas the sun is our major source of energy. So those are our two laws of thermodynamics that matter to ecosystems. Now, the Earth's incoming and outgoing flows of radiant or solar energy must be equal for global temperatures to stay constant. Now, human activities, as we'll discuss, are changing the composition in the atmosphere, thus inducing the greenhouse effect, thus allowing heat to accumulate on Earth. But again, the ecosystem is a balance of energy, how it comes in, how it changes forms. It's never created, never destroyed, but again, it can change form. Because that's how our ecosystem is balanced. It's all of way the energy moves. Now, we talk about energy because we want to talk about what we call trophic levels. And this is a level at which an organism feeds. So we have a couple different levels here, and they can be broken up into two broad categories: autotrophic, or self-feeders, that synthesize organic compounds of their bodies from inorganic precursors. So these are photosynthesizers, both photo and chemoautotrophs, that use energy from the sun or the energy from chemicals to derive sugars from CO2. And then we have heterotrophs, where we fall in, which we physically cannot synthesize our own organic compounds, thus we need to eat organisms to get our energy. So again, energy is a kind of a big thing, which is why we talked about the second and first law of thermodynamics. Now, our trophic levels are divided into primary producers, i.e. the autotrophs, and then also divided into consumers. Now, there are herbivores, which consume our primary producers. We have our primary consumers, or primary carnivores, which eat the herbivores; our secondary carnivores, which eat our primary herbivores, or our primary carnivores or our herbivores. And then we finally have our detritivores, which eat decaying matter, or they're also called the decomposers, one of the two. Now, we can look at an example of this where we have multiple trophic levels, where we have our primary producers, the things that eat our primary producers, in our trophic level 2, trophic level 3, which eats our herbivores, trophic level 4, which eats our primary carnivores. And then we have our detritivores, which eat everything once they're dead. These include large birds, worms, microbes, as well as fungi. But again, this is what we have for a trophic cascade. Energy comes from this level, goes to the next level, goes to the next level, goes to the next level. Now, you'll notice that the level, i.e. the thickness of this line, decreases as we go up in levels, because the reality of there's a lot of energy that goes into primary producers, but only a small amount of it is transferred to the next level, and a small amount of that is transferred to the next level, and so on and so forth. So it's a really interesting thing, but we'll get to that in a few moments. But let's talk about productivity. Now, productivity is the rate at which an organisms in the trophic level collectively synthesize new organic matter. Now, in this case, for primary productivity, it's simply the productivity of the primary producers, i.e. how much are they photosynthesizing. And for our consumers, it's respiration, which is the rate at which primary producers break down, or other organisms break down organic compounds. Now, this leads us to two terms, GPP or NPP, not to be confused with GDP, i.e. the economic term, but GPP is what we call gross primary productivity. It's the rate at which new primary producers synthesize new organic matter. And then we have NPP or net primary productivity, which is the GPP, less the respiration of the primary producers, i.e. when you subtract all the respiration the primary producers do from the GPP, that leaves us with our NPP, i.e. whatever sugar is left over that isn't consumed by our primary producers. And then we have secondary productivity, which is the productivity of a heterotrophic level. Now, we process energy. That's how ecosystems work. It's just a transfer of energy around an ecosystem. Now, a small fraction of incoming solar radiation is actually physically captured by our primary producers, which is about 1% of year at the global level. Now, what do they do with that energy from the sun? Well, they take that energy, they use photosynthesis, they capture it and store that energy as chemical bonds, i.e. sugar. Now, sugar, as in a food, just carries energy. So we have a tiny amount of energy from the sun is captured by photosynthesizers, converted into chemical energy. Now, what happens when you ingest energy? Well, the amount of chemical bond energy actually decreases as energy is passed from one trophic level to the next. Now, about 50% of all chemical bond energy is not assimilated and is essentially pooped out in the form of feces. It's also called egested. I don't like that term, but that's the technical term. I'm just going to say pooped out. So about 50% of all the chemical energy you eat, you poop out. 33% of that energy you bring in is used for cellular respiration. 17% of that is actually converted into biomass, some of which is then available to the next consumer. So again, to break it down in terms of a grasshopper, 50% is pooped out, 33% is used for motion and all that fun stuff, and 17% is used for growth. Now, if 17% is used for growth, i.e. building mass, that means that 17% is thus available for whatever can eat a grasshopper. So ecologists use essentially this rule of thumb to figure out the amount of chemical energy available to the trophic level that is higher than the one that you're currently at. And it's typically about 10%. So what does that mean? Well, solar energy, only about 1% is captured by primary producers. Of that energy, remember, some is used for respiration, some is used for growth. Whatever is used for growth, about 10% of that is physically used, transferred to the next higher level. Then 10% of their energy is transferred to the next level, and then to the next level, and so on and so forth. So again, only about 10% of energy that is captured by any given level is available for the following level. And you'll notice a lot of it is lost as respiration, or fecal matter, or as death, or some is even lost as heat as well. But again, all of this comes together where we only transfer about 10% of energy between our different trophic levels. Now, this leads us to ecosystem productivity. So we have NPP per unit area of all these different places. You notice that not every ecosystem is the same. Extreme deserts have very, very low NPP, whereas algal beds and tropical rainforests have very high NPP. And you can look at that at the local level, or you can look at the global level. How much productivity we see, and we see high productivity in tropical rainforests as well as in open oceans, but very, very low levels of NPP in the open ocean. And you can even see something that like algal beds and reefs, which have high per unit NPP, but at the global level, they come out for a very, very low amount of our global NPP. So that's our primary production. Now, what limits carnivores? Now, the number of trophic levels is limited by energy availability. And what limits our top carnivores is what essentially is the exponential decline of chemical energy bond limits, of chemical energy as we go up in different levels. So as I mentioned, as we go up every level in our trophic system, we only send about 10% of the energy. So by the time you get to the top, by the time you get to a secondary carnivore, only about 1/1000th of the energy captured by photosynthesis will make it to our secondary carnivores. So this is what this looks like. Lots of energy is found in our primary producers. Only 10% of that makes it to our primary consumers or herbivores. And then again, 10%, 10%, and 10%. So if we start off with 1,000 calories, only about 1.2 calories will make it to our top consumers, such as humans overall. So again, energy flow is what ecosystems are about, but only a small amount makes it from level to level to level. Again, only about 10%. And we can represent this actually as what we call ecological pyramids, which is a pyramid of energy flow or a pyramid of productivity. We can also represent this as a pyramid of biomass or a pyramid of numbers. So let's take a peek at this. So we have a pyramid of energy, high amounts of energy in our photosynthesis, a little bit in our herbivores, a little bit more, a little bit less in our first level carnivores. Then we can look at the pyramid of biomass. We have large amounts of herbivorous plankton and very, very small amounts of phytoplankton. That's one way we can see the inverted pyramid of biomass. But commonly, the way we see our pyramid of biomass is very, very high amounts of photosynthetic organisms, a little bit less of herbivores, less first level carnivores. Then we can look at the pyramid of numbers where we have high amounts of primary producers, less herbivores, and significantly less carnivores. So we can look at our distribution of sizes, of amounts of energy, and so on and so forth as these sort of pyramids. Now, we can look at how these trophic levels interact. In the first case we're going to look at this is actually what we call a trophic cascade. And this is the process by which effects exerted at an upper level or a lower level, but we'll talk about an upper level first, flow to influence one or more lower levels. Now, there are two distinct types of trophic level interactions, top-down and bottom-up effects. So let's talk about these now. So look at top-down effects first. So in this case, we have a stream. It has a large number of carnivorous fish, and they have fewer primary carnivores and more herbivorous insects and lower level of algae. So we can see the number of vertebrates with no fish or with trout present, and the number of algae with no fish or trout present. So the idea being is as we increase the amount of trout, it's essentially keeping down the amount of insects, which in turn eat the algae. And so again, as we have high amounts of the top predator, it essentially causes essentially a larger effect on the things that the fish eat, which in turn has a pretty dramatic effect on the primary consumers. Now we can look at top-down effects in another way. So we have carnivorous nymphs, which eat herbivorous insects, which eat the algae. So when there is no fish, it causes the population of herbivorous insects to go down, but the population of algae to go up. Now, when there's fish present, it keeps the number of damselflied nymphs up, the amount of herbivorous insects goes up, thus decreasing the amount of algae. But again, it all stems from the top level here, and this top level is our carnivorous fish. And so, again, there are two states here, as we can see. Now, trophic cascades can exist in two states. So along the west coast of North America, the otter/sea urchin/kelp ecosystems exist with either low or high level of sea otter populations, but giving rise to two distinct states of this ecosystem. So kind of a cool thing. Now, human removal of carnivores is a pretty strong effect on top-down effects. So for instance, a scientist named Aldo Leopold, he actually posited that effects long before scientific hypotheses were articulated, so back in the early 1920s, because he was looking at the overfishing of cod. In particular, cod is at about 10% of their previous numbers, and the prey of cod have actually become more abundant because we've removed a top predator, thus a top-down effect on the ecosystem. Now, we also see the effects with jaguars and mountain lions' absence on Barrow, Colorado Island. Now, this led low amounts of jaguars of mountain lions led to smaller predators becoming more abundant. Again, affecting the top of the plateau, affecting everything below it. Now this leads us to bottom effects, which is the exact opposite of top of effects, where essentially where primary productivity is stimulated, leading to changes above them. So let's look at an example of this, where we have primary producers. As we increase primary producers or increase their level of productivity, so does the things that eat, the amount of biomass of the things that eat our primary producers, as does the amount of things that eat our primary or herbivores does. So again, we stimulate the bottom, it stimulates the things up, and stimulates the things up as well. So kind of a cool thing. Now, those are the way ecosystems are controlled, either top-down or bottom-up, but biodiversity and stability is a really interesting thing. Now, there's a really awesome scientist. His name is David Tillman. Now, David Tillman has spent his life studying species richness, and he's documented that as species richness increases, so does the stability of the ecosystem. Now, what do I mean by stability? Well, I mean stability as in an ecosystem's capacity to withstand a perturbation, i.e. be stable over time. Now, what his research has showed that plots with more species showed less year-to-year variation in biomass. Um, and a really interesting thing he saw that when there was a drought, he saw a decline in biomass that was actually negatively related to species richness. So as if the higher species richness area are better able to weather the storm of biomass. And you can see this here. It's a pretty cool experiment he did with grasses. Definitely take a peek at it when you have a few minutes. Now, what can we conclude from David Tillman's work? Well, it's actually kind of a not accepted thing. He's seen some really great effects of biodiversity on ecosystem stability, but it really is kind of up in the air right now. But the reality is David Tillman does show a really important role of stability as well as biodiversity and species richness and on ecosystems as well. Now, species richness, as we've defined already in our previous lecture, as in the number of species in a given area, it is influenced by ecosystem characteristics, including primary productivity, habitat heterogeneity, i.e. how much different types of habitat is there. High habitat heterogeneity means there's lots of different habitats. Low habitat heterogeneity means there's very few habitats. And as well as climatic factors, i.e. what does the climate look like? Now we can look at some factors affecting species richness, so primary productivity, plant structural complexity, as well as temperature range, and the number of species of mammals, lizards, and plants. You'll see as primary productivity increases, the number of species richness increases, eventually reaching a plateau and dropping over time. As we increase the number of plant structural complexity, the number of lizard species increases. Now, structural complexity just means how many different habitats the plant provides for the lizards. So as that increases, so does the number of lizard species. And then we can see the number of mammal species declines as temperature increases as well. So kind of a really cool thing. Lots of factors affect species richness within our ecosystems, tied to both abiotic as well as biotic factors as well. Now, tropical regions are really interesting. As you guys probably know, they have the highest diversity, and now they have really, it's what we call a species diversity decline, where there's a biogeographic gradient in the number of species that is correlated with latitude. And so what does that look like? Well, we can look at this as latitudinal gradient. So the number of species here is low, and as we go down towards the tropics, down here into Central and South America, the amount of species increases. So as we get lower and lower in our latitude, the number of species increases. So it's kind of a cool thing. But the other thing is that the evolutionary age of tropical regions is also higher. There's also increased productivity in the tropics. There's a stability and consistency of conditions in the tropics. Predation is a thing, as well as lots of habitat and spatial heterogeneity, which give the tropical regions the really high amounts of diversity. So just wanted to make mention of that. Tropics are a really cool area. All sorts of cool biodiversity overall. Sorry about that. It's leading the tropics to have high amounts of diversity. Now, there's also this really interesting idea of island biogeography, and we talked about this a little bit with evolution at the beginning of the semester, but Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson, so two really fantastic scientists, proposed that there's this really interesting species-area relationship. Now, what does that mean? Well, as you increase the amount of area, the amount of species increase as well. So it's pretty cool. Now, what they hypothesize here is that as you increase geographic area and the amount of isolation, you too increase the amount of species. Now, the interesting thing here is that islands have the tendency to accumulate more and more species through dispersion, i.e. things coming to the island. But the rate of colonization must decrease as the pool of potential colonized species becomes depleted as well, and the rate of extinction should increase with more species on an island. Now, this leads us to a really interesting thing they developed called the equilibrium model. And now, at some point, extinctions and colonizations on our island should be equal. And so these two scientists, MacArthur and Wilson, they're really important scientists, or else I wouldn't be talking about them. They hypothesized two things with this model. The first is that island species richness is dynamic in its equilibrium between colonization and extinction, and island size and distance from the mainland would affect colonization and extinction as well. Now, what we can see here is that the long-term experimental field studies suggest that situation is actually more complicated than at first believed, but let's talk about what they first believed, where they have the rate of colonization versus the number of species, and as well as the extinction rate. So what they hypothesize is that as the number of species increases, the colonization rate should go down, but the extinction rate should go up. But this differs depending on how far you are. So as you're near the mainland, the colonization rate should be high and then go down. As you're farther away from the mainland, colonization should be lower and go down over time as well. But small islands should experience higher levels of species extinction, and larger islands should experience lower levels of species extinctions. But we can actually look at this data in real time, where we look at the number of bird species and the island size. In red, it's more than 3,200 kilometers from the island of New Guinea. Blue is 8,800 to 3,200 kilometers from New Guinea, and yellow here, or gold, whatever you want to call it, is less than 800 kilometers from New Guinea. And you can see that as you increase the island size, the number of bird species increases. So it's not quite as simple as what we're seeing here, what they predicted. But again, the equilibrium model does do a pretty good job of describing species richness of our islands at a broad geographic scale. So that's going to be the end of our little chat about ecosystem ecology for the day. Hope you guys learned something. If you have any questions, please let me know. But otherwise, have a fantastic day.